Hi everyone, my name is Tara Coltman-Patel. I'm a Senior Research Associate at Lancaster University. Not too long ago I finished my PhD in Linguistics at Nottingham-Trent University, and I looked at the representation of weight and obesity in British newspapers. And I'm going to talk to you today about one part of that research, which is focused on how internalised biases can influence linguistic strategies of self-representation through the analysis of personal stories. Before I start, I just want to do a quick disclaimer about language. Within the fat acceptance movement, many participants use the term fat to describe themselves in order to reclaim the term and neutralise its negative connotations. So the term fat will be used throughout this paper in the same manner as a neutral descriptor as opposed to a discriminatory slur. I'll quickly go over my data and approach. I analysed UK national newspapers published between the 1st of January 2006 and the 31st of December 2016, so that's 11 years altogether. These are the newspapers that I included. They were the most popular newspapers at the time of data publication. And when I downloaded the newspapers from Nexus UK, I specified that the words obesity or obese had to appear within the articles at least 3 times. And I did this just to better ensure that the articles I was getting were about obesity, because that was my focus. So once I'd done all that, in total, I had a corpus of 16,419 articles, and then once I'd cleaned the articles, I had a total of 9,750,159 words. Today, however, I'm going to discuss an analysis that I did on a small subcorpus of this larger corpus, made up of 604 personal stories. So these are stories about individuals and families, as opposed to stories about obesity in general. And in terms of the approach that I took when analysing this, it was a corpus-assisted critical discourse analysis. Because of time, I don't have time to go through the downsampling process that I underwent in order to arrive at these 604 personal stories. But if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them about the downsampling process that I went through. So just let me know if you've got any questions. But the personal story subcorpus, this table here is a breakdown of all the newspapers and how many personal stories were found in each one. Although the personal stories do appear in broadsheet newspapers, the subcorpus is really heavily skewed towards tabloid newspapers, which, I mean, that's kind of to be expected with these types of stories. So in total, the subcorpus has 768,686 words, and within the 604 stories, 543 different individuals are discussed, and of those 543 different individuals, 372, which equates to 68.5%, are women. Okay, so moving on to the analysis, the first thing I did was a keyword analysis. And in terms of my reference corpus, the reference corpus I used was my larger corpus minus these personal stories. And the statistical measure that I used was log likelihood, and then I ranked my list by log ratio. So looking at the list, there are several different analytical paths that I could have taken here. Firstly, the presence of words like I'd, her, myself, they didn't surprise me at all, really, because these are personal stories after all, and individuals are given a voice in these stories to a certain extent. You know, they include quotes and stuff from them, so I expected to see these kinds of words there. And when I was building the reference corpus, an aspect of my inclusion criteria was that the words my and her were in there. So I expected to see them on the keyword list, to be honest. And then moving further down the list, there are words about like surgery. It seems specifically gastric bypass surgery. And I didn't really want to focus on that because I wanted to look at a broader experience of obesity that people have rather than just one specific experience that people could have when it comes to their weights. But then when I got to the word felt, that immediately jumped out at me. Because I have found the coverage of people with obesity to be quite dehumanizing until this point. I'd looked at the general representation of obesity as opposed to a representation of a specific person with obesity. And it had been quite dehumanizing. And I now have this subcorpus of stories where individuals are given a voice to some extent. And the presence of the verb felt really kind of indicated to me that people are talking about their feelings and emotions, or at least their feelings and emotions could be talked about by the journalists themselves. And that's inherently humanizing. It's the opposite of dehumanizing. So I thought this might be a really interesting thing to explore here, to see how the verb felt is used. And you can't see it on the list here because I couldn't fit it on the slide, but further down the list is also the verb feel. and it occurs 804 times. It has a log ratio score of 2.02, so it's pretty high. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to follow these verbs and I'm going to see what happens. I'm going to see if the individual's feelings are being talked about by themselves, by the journalists, and if so, what kinds of things are being discussed. So I decided that moving forward, I would focus on the verbs feel and felt. So with feel and felt, I decided that I would start with a collocation analysis to see what types of words they occur with. In terms of a collocation span, rather than go broad like L5, R5, I decided I'd make it quite narrow because, as I said, I was interested in seeing how these individuals feel and felt. So it was really their R collocates I was quite interested in. So I decided that the span I would do is L0, R1. I used frequency as an association measure because I was interested in the frequent collocations here. I chose R2 in addition to R1 because I wanted to allow for adverbs. So maybe people would say that they feel very happy, and I didn't want to miss out on any emotional feeling because there was an adverb being used. Now, unsurprisingly, the verbs feel and felt frequently co-occurred with adjectives. They're frequently followed by adjectives. Now, broadly speaking, I could kind of categorize these into positive, negative, and neutral categories, these adjectives, very crudely, I will say. The neutral adjectives that I found were adjectives like full, I feel full, fine, hungry, different. They were not as common as adjectives which could be kind of categorized as positive or negative. And when I was kind of crudely categorizing these adjectives, I did account for negation. So if somebody said, I don't feel fantastic, I would count that as a negative use of that adjective. So you can see from the examples that I've given you here, some of the adjectives that I've categorized as positive are adjectives like better, fantastic, good, and sexy. And then adjectives that had negative connotations and were used in a negative way were adjectives like ashamed, guilty, bad, and uncomfortable. There was a pretty equal split between positive and negative use of adjectives. There was slightly more positive use of adjectives with 194 compared to 183 negative adjectives. However, there was more variety of negative adjectives, which is something that I will talk about soon. I'll start with positive adjectives. When feel and felt co-occur with an adjective used positively, overwhelmingly the subject under discussion is weight loss, in 88.6% of the instances to be exact. So in these examples, when they say they feel and then a positive use of an adjective, they are talking about how they feel since losing weight. So you can see from these examples, they say they felt fantastic after they lost weight, they feel proud now that they've lost weight. And these are typical examples here of this linguistic pattern. So when you look at these examples and you think about how these individuals are representing themselves, it appears to be pretty positive. You know, weight loss is depicted as something great. These individuals report feeling great, and they're representing themselves pretty positively. But as I was reading through them, I did start to notice an interesting linguistic pattern that co-occurred with these colloquial pairs, and it involved presupposition triggers. Okay, so as you can see in these examples, all three of them have a presupposition trigger, which I've now put in bold as well. We have since, after, and again. Since, after, and again, they're change of state and temporal constructions. And of the presupposition triggers that I found co-occurring with the feel, felt adjective colloquial pairs, the vast majority of them were these kind of temporal and change of state presupposition triggers, like you can see here. And in terms of how often presupposition triggers occurred with these adjectives, I found 47% of the positive adjectives co-occurred with presupposition triggers as well, which I found very interesting, and I thought that was a very interesting pattern, so definitely worth exploring. But in terms of these examples here, since, after, and again, as I said, they're change of state and temporal constructions, and so the individuals report feeling fantastic and good after and since losing weight, feeling proud again as a result of weight loss. So as I said before, on the surface these statements seem pretty positive, but considering that presupposition triggers are a frequent pattern here, I thought I wanted to take a closer look at the role that they play in these self-representations. And when you do take a closer look at the role that presupposition triggers play in these self-representations of these individuals, you can see that actually the opposite may be true, and these individuals are not presenting themselves as positively as I originally thought. Okay, so because the presupposition triggers that are used in these in the data and in these examples, because they're temporal and change of state, what we end up with is a before and after comparison. Because the basic presupposition logic is that A presupposes B if B is a precondition of truth or falsity of A. So the words again, since, after, they trigger a presupposition. And if I bring in the examples just to kind of demonstrate it, in order for it to be true that you feel proud again, it has to be true that you did not feel proud before and potentially even felt shame before. And what the presupposition trigger again does here is it inserts a comparative element into the statement. So if we lose it, I held my head up and felt proud facing the world. There's no insinuation there in that statement that before you lost weight, you did not feel proud. But adding again creates a presupposition that this individual didn't feel proud before losing weight. With the second example, in order to feel fantastic after weight loss, it has to be true that you felt negatively or bad in some way before weight loss. Now, these feelings, they obviously won't be binary. The presupposition triggers don't provide a window into exactly how these individuals felt previously, but they do add an implication to the statement that these feelings that these individuals have now in their post-weight loss body are improved feelings compared to previously in their heavier body. Now, because they do introduce this comparative element, what we end up with is two identities and two representations. One identity is explicit and one is implicit. The explicit identity is this new thin body identity, and it's represented as very positively. You know, the individuals are happy, they're thinner, and they're proud. But the implicit identity, which is enforced kind of through presupposition here, it's the past identity who was heavier, felt negatively about their body, potentially felt shame. And so what's interesting is because these two identities being compared, it's almost as if they're critiquing a previous version of themselves in order to bolster the current version of themselves. So it's essentially this nuanced positive self-representation whereby negative self-representation is being used to facilitate this newer positive self-representation. Now, you could be thinking that this is a bit of a stretch. These presuppositions are incredibly subtle, and I feel you, but I'm going to move on now to the negative adjectives, because when the negative adjectives are used, this positive self-representation by way of negative self-representation is much more explicit. So while the positive adjectives were used to shape an explicit post-weight loss happy thinner identity, the negative adjectives are used to shape two different explicit identities. The first is a past pre-weight loss fat identity that's presented very negatively, and the second is a present fat identity which is also presented very negatively. So I'll give you some examples. I feel ashamed to be here, I can't lose weight, I'm fat, lazy and stupid. I remember on my 39th birthday feeling totally depressed, full of self-loathing. I weighed 21.5 stone and I looked and felt dreadful. Soon I assumed everyone I came into contact with thought I was fat and ugly. By my early 30s I felt suicidal. So the second and third examples I'll start with here, they're in the past tense, and so there's an insinuation that the negative identity is also a past self, one that the individual no longer identifies with. And in fact, when I expand the examples and actually read the articles that they belong to, they are articles about weight loss, and in these statements the individuals are describing the previous self, a self that they no longer identify with. So this is further evidence of negative self-representation being used to facilitate this overall strategy of positive self-representation. Now, if I move to the first example, there's no positive representation here. It's present tense. This is how the individual feels now. This is a story about a person with obesity. They haven't lost weight, and it's just pure undiluted negative self-representation. This individual details how they feel ashamed, how they believe they are lazy and unintelligent. And shame, laziness and unintelligence, they are all key aspects of societal ideologies surrounding weight and obesity, and they degrade and oppress individuals, yet here they are being echoed by these oppressed individuals. Now, in terms of presupposition triggers, it's not a pattern with negative adjectives, but I did notice a different pattern, and when negative adjectives are used, they co-occur with different adjectives that also have negative connotations. These adjectives often appear in succession. You can see I've got them in bold here, kind of fat, lazy, stupid, really hammering home the point that that this is a negative representation that's happening here. And it's not just adjectives too. You can see in the second example, there's a noun self-loathing that's also used, reinforcing this notion that fat is bad, essentially. And that's the outcome of these representations. We have two different identities. One is thin and represented positively, and one is fat and represented negatively. Now, the way these identities are perpetuated, we've seen so far, is either through a nuanced positive self-representation, whereby negative self-representation is used as a kind of point of comparison, but then we do also have this overt negative self-representation too. Now, I found this really, really interesting, and I thought I wonder if this is occurring in different linguistic patterns. And I also wonder if there are other ways, other different representation strategies that these individuals are using to represent themselves. So I decided that I would look at a different linguistic pattern moving forward and to see if I could see this happening again, or if I could see something different happening with the way in which these individuals represent themselves. So I went back to the keyword list and I saw the word I. It has a log ratio score of 2.52. So again, that's pretty high. And I thought, well, this is a great way to explore self-representation. So I decided to do a collocation analysis of I, following the same thing that I did with feel and felt. I did originally expand the collocation span to L5, R5, but in doing so, it was the immediate R1 collocates that became a particular interest. So if I show you this table, you can just see within the top 5 R1 collocates of I, these before and after temporal contrasts seen previously in the feel and felt analysis, they're immediately realised here. We've got was, we've got am, we've got had, we've got had. And by this point, I was halfway through my chapter of the thesis and I decided that I had to make a decision here. So I decided I would only follow the concordance lines of I was and I am. So that's where the analysis takes us next, is following I was and I am, these collocate pairs. 725 of the 1,728 concordance lines are followed by a negative adjective, and they explicitly and directly engage with the fat is negative, thin is positive identity seen previously. So again, these constructions, these I was plus negative adjective constructions, they're used in stories about weight loss. And the explicit identity in these stories is the post-weight loss thin identity. But these specific constructions, I was plus the negative adjectives, they are used to discuss the past fat identity in these stories, the comparative identity, if you will. And these constructions, these negative adjective constructions, they're used to refer back to their past self and negatively represent their heavier self. So we've got some really quite harrowing examples here. I was fat and ugly, my self-esteem felt so low I became depressed. I was too ashamed of my body to try talking to girls. I was sick with shame. I was so fat that I wanted to die. And all of these things, low self-esteem, feeling unattractive, feeling shame, having suicidal ideations, they are just textbook examples of internalized weight bias. And here, unlike the previous positive adjective pattern with presupposition triggers, these biases, they aren't hidden by presupposition. They are just out there explicitly to see. So again, what we have here is an example of negative self-representation being used to facilitate this wider goal of a positive self-representation. So moving on to I am, out of the 373 concordance lines, 59 are followed by a negative comment about themselves. So as I said before, in addition to stories of weight loss, I did also have stories of people who currently have obesity as well. Weight loss stories were the majority, but there were stories of people who currently have obesity too. And pretty much in these types of stories, they would detail how much they dislike their lives, how much they dislike themselves. And this is primarily where I was seeing these I am negative comment constructions was in these stories. So I've got some examples here, as you can see. Again, really harrowing things. I'm fat, lazy, and stupid. I'm eating myself to death. I'm gross and a whale. I don't look normal. I want to change who I am entirely. There's just no positive spin that you can put on these representations. They aren't degrading a past identity to further enhance a positive present identity. This is pure and simple negative self-representation. And it's clear from the language used and from the tropes employed. Greed, laziness, being a burden, feeling unintelligent and unattractive, that these individuals have internalized weight biases. The notion of internalized bias is a valuable thing to think about because when we think about linguistic strategies of representation, internalized biases and how these can affect them isn't really currently accounted for. For example, the prominent ideological square model by Van Dyck argues that information which could give a bad impression of the speaker, writer, and the social group to which they belong may be left out in order to influence their listeners and readers in a preferred direction. And then conversely, information which could provide a good impression of the speaker and writer and the social group to which they belong may be emphasized for ideological effect. Now, this model has been proven again and again, successfully applied to numerous studies. But the results that I have indicate that because of internalized biases, the existence of which has been documented in pretty much every marginalized group, because of internalized biases, there is potentially a fifth move here. So express and emphasize information that is negative about us. I have this in grey because a lot more research needs to be done here. You know, my data is not ideal, given that these stories are edited by journalists and edited by the editors of the newspapers as well. But yeah, I wasn't looking for this. I wasn't looking at specifically at strategies of self-representation when I started. I just stumbled across it. But I definitely do think that the results of my research indicate that there is significant reason to explore how internalized biases can affect self-representation, and in turn affect the linguistic strategies of representation, how we currently view them. So to summarize, because I realize I've thrown quite a bit at you, the evidence accrued from the personal stories I analysed demonstrated that the individual shaped two different identities. The first is a thin identity, which is associated with positive characteristics such as beauty, health, happiness, and the second identity is a fat identity, which is associated with negative characteristics, including unattractiveness, laziness, poor health, and unhappiness. Now, to perpetuate these identities, the individuals engage in two variations of self-representation. The first is using negative self-representation as a tool to facilitate a wider goal of positive self-representation. And this was the strategy used when the thin identity was the explicit identity under discussion in the corpus. And then within this strategy, the negative attributes of the past identity are highlighted in order to further emphasize the positive attributes of the present thin identity. Now, the second variation that we found of self-representation was just pure negative self-representation. And this strategy was found when the fat identity was the primary identity under discussion. And these results reveal that harmful and widespread ideologies about weight are internalized by those they target and reproduced through the language that they use. And finally, while I believe I have evidence of people operating outside the boundaries of current linguistic strategies of representation, given that the control of the narrative doesn't lie solely with the individuals featured in these stories, a lot more research needs to be done on different types of data to determine if, in fact, internalized biases can affect the ideological square model and linguistic strategies of representation, how we currently view them. Thank you. References here in case you want them, and email me if you have any questions. Thank you.